All right, I suggest we get started. Welcome everyone to our next seminar in the series supported by SPEPA. SPEPA is the strategic partnership for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. It's an activity, a bilateral activity between the European Union and a range of other countries, supported by the European Commission and the German government at the European end, and at this end by Melbourne Climate Futures. And as you can guess from the name, by the way, my name is Peter Rayner. I'm the Australian lead for the project. And I should acknowledge that I'm talking to you today from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. The focus of SPEPA is around action, to implementation of the Paris Agreement and how do we support climate action. So it's kind of logical coming towards the end of the series to kind of address the question, what kind of action can we expect from a very significant actor in the Australian context, which is the Australian federal government. It's not the only actor in play, of course, thankfully, for those of us interested in strong climate action for the last few years, but it's a major one. And we've got today a joint seminar from two people who are beautifully placed to talk about that from a range of perspectives. Delighted to introduce Associate Professor Peter Christoff. Peter is an Associate Professor in the School of Earth Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. It's a new school. I still can't get my head around the name, despite the fact that I'm in it. And he's also a senior research fellow with Melbourne Climate Futures, who are one of the kind of organisers for this session. And also Professor Robyn Eckersley. Robyn is a Redmond Barry Professor of Political Science and has written very extensively across areas more generally around political theory, but with a strong focus on the environment. So it's going to be really interesting to hear the range of perspectives and kind of deep knowledge, both theoretical and practical. Both Peter and Robyn have had kind of a very close and hands-on view of how some of these things work. It'll be very interesting to hear their perspectives on what's actually expected going forward. I think Peter's going to start off. They're going to kind of arrange this as a tag team. And at the end, as usual, we'll have some Q&A. Ask you to put questions in the Q&A, and we'll get around to moderating and addressing those at the end. So I'll get out of the way and get off air and on mute and hand over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm just trying to get the slides to respond, and they appear not to be. Angela, we may have a problem. Right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Look, first of all, so thank you, Peter. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge that we've got a mixed audience here, including, I'm hoping, quite a few European colleagues. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about today will perhaps be covering ground that is more familiar to our Australian audience, but let's just move through that quickly and perhaps we can elaborate on points when we get to question time. For those of us who've been looking at Australian climate politics and energy politics over the last decade or more, I think we could probably say that there's some good news and some bad news when one talks about the current context as we move towards the next federal election. The good news seems to be that the brutal decade of the climate wars, which really ran from 2007 to about 2018, that period where we saw 5 prime ministers deposed largely as a result of both internal and external dissension over climate policy, that period of enormous political turbulence has largely subsided. And so in the last 3 years or 4 years or so, there's been relative peace since the 2018 election, disciplined by the outcome of that election and the politics of coal mining in Queensland. There, of course, would have to be some measure of scepticism, though, as to what's happened in the term of the current government. It's certainly a case of bad news in that we have had an ongoing persistence of very weak national targets and also very weak national climate mitigation policy, including with government interventions attempting to try and keep gas in the domestic fuel mix. And of course, Australia's contribution to global carbon production has actually increased in terms of the increasing participation of Australia in the export of fossil fuels, coal, and of course, also gas. What we're going to try and do in this talk is a couple of things. Firstly, to set a context for what we see the election looking like, and then beyond that, to talk about where we think we might head. I want to start with 2 questions. First, so I will begin to open up this discussion about context, and then Robyn will take over. I want to begin with a question of paradox, and then Robyn will talk about a puzzle to do with Scott Morrison's performance in Glasgow, and that will then open up, I think, the discussion about policies both now and also post-2022, the national election, which we expect to be sometime in May. Let me begin to talk about the paradox of Australia's emissions performance. And I'm trying to get the slides to move. Right. So there is a paradox of emissions performance. In the absence of significant national climate policy and associated national mechanisms, we've nevertheless seen quite substantial declines in national emissions over the period of the last decade or so. And there's a question there, there's a problem there as to why we've seen these positive results almost in the face of national inertia and inaction, and then what the prospects for this might mean for mitigation policy and politics into the future. So what we've seen is, I think, a decline in emissions, and this slide here points to the changing projected emissions for 2030 based on increasing significant performance in emissions reduction over the last bundle of years. And as you can see, the expectations of hitting a lower 2030 target has really ramped up over the period from 2012 through to the present. In fact, there's an expectation now based on government modelling, which I would suggest is quite conservative, that Australia may certainly meet its very weak 26 to 28% emissions reduction target below 2005 levels and actually overachieve it by at least 4 and up to 9 percentage points. The important thing to note is that there's been a really significant change in a number of different sectors, and most prominently in the sector which provides the greatest amount of emissions for Australia, namely the electricity sector, where emissions have fallen by about 23% since 2009. And there's been a significant displacement of coal in particular by renewables. That's not to say that emissions are tracking brilliantly well. As I mentioned, our place in the global fossil fuel export market has meant that we've seen emissions growth associated with the export of liquid natural gas, both in terms of stationary energy production and also fugitive emissions. But the question is, how and why has this occurred? I'm trying to get the slides to move again. Right. There are perhaps a couple of reasons. The first is, one may argue that in fact national policy has become rather irrelevant. In fact, there's an article that Robyn and I have published recently which looks at the dynamism of subnational energy and emissions policies and targets. And when you look at this slide, you can see that the targets that have been set, both in terms of the 2030 emissions reduction target and also the adoption quite early on of a net zero 2050 target by all states and territories, has meant that actually below the cover of national policy, we've seen really quite aggressive moves by some very important states, such as New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria, in emissions reduction. In other words, there's a driver there which seems to suggest that the de facto emissions cut target, if you're looking at current state and territory targets amalgamated, is somewhere between 37 to 42% by 2030. In other words, we're going to well and truly exceed the national target as it's currently proclaimed. There are a range of reasons why this might happen. Certainly the state policies and state initiatives propelling investment in renewables has been one important part. But, and again, I'm going to try and get the slides to move. Angela, I wonder if you have control over this rather than me. Right. When you look at what's been happening at the subnational level, and here's just one slide beginning to indicate some of those moves, we can see that the uptake of renewables, in particular distributed photovoltaics, and also changes in demand, but these are perhaps a little more transient, have decreased quite substantially, reliant on those large coal-fired power stations, which have been the core mechanism for electricity generation in Australia. Again, to move on. So in recent times, we've seen substantial declines in operational demand, record declines over time, and this decline in reliance on coal-fired power is quite profound. The overall impact on the power generation sector, as I stressed, the most important sector for emissions production at this point in time, has been significant. Again, frozen slide. Okay, so when one looks at the power generation sector and also thinks about the transition to electric vehicles, but we can leave that to one side for the moment, we can see something happening which is quite substantial and is in part now outside the control of policy. In other words, whereas previously policies, including subnational policies, very importantly, have been the driving force for a transition, decarbonisation of the economy, we've now seen how the market has taken over substantially. And the economics of fossil fuel power generation and of renewables has transformed the trajectory of that market quite significantly. So in 2021, Australia had 22 coal-fired power stations operating, but the fleet is a very old one. Average age in New South Wales, 38 years for power plants, 35 for Victoria, 25 in Queensland. The costs of maintenance are continuing to increase, whereas at the same time, we're seeing a high and increasing private investment in renewables, lowering the cost of energy from renewables, both in terms of private dispersed and large-scale wind and solar, competition to develop and establish the world's largest large-scale batteries. Each bid seems to be larger than the one before. So what we're beginning to see is a displacement of coal-fired power generation and gas by this process of infiltration and transformation by renewables, battery storage, and a crisis of value and profitability for the coal-fired power sector, which is now seeing a move out of that sector by companies in an almost uncontrolled way, with companies writing down or writing off the value of power stations, and very clearly with no chance of any new coal-fired power station or unsubsidised new gas-fired power station being built. And the recent record very much shows that that is the case. The unpredicted closure of Yallourn, OECD's dirtiest power station, the fight over Liddell, the promised earlier closure at Eraring, Australia's largest coal-fired power station, all of these things point to what I would suggest is a disorderly collapse in coal-fired power generation. Now, in terms of projections and predictions, there have been a number of futures envisaged for Australian domestic coal. Frank Iozzo and his colleagues at the ANU a couple of years ago considered two scenarios for coal-fired power. The more moderate scenario suggested coal would be less than half the present level in terms of its contribution to generation by 2030 and decline by 90% by 2040. There's a much faster or more aggressive scenario which saw coal reduced by 2/3 by 2030 and very, very low levels during or towards the end of the 2030s. The AEMO had an integrated system plan with 5 scenarios, which sees a reduction. The more creative or step change scenarios there see a reduction in coal-fired capacity by between 60 and 80% by 2040. But I would suggest, and of emissions reductions, if one pays close attention to these trajectories. And under those circumstances, it leaves us with a puzzle. And here I'm going to hand over to Robyn. The puzzle is, why did Scott Morrison and why does the coalition still believe that those sorts of the targets that can be achieved are as weak as they project and expect? Robyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I've just requested control of the slideshow, so I'll just see if I can do that. I have to wait for Angela to organise that at her end. If it doesn't work, Angela, I'll ask you to just move the slides for me.
And good luck with the sticky buttons.
Yes, they are sticky. There we go. Great. Now I've got an animated display here. So Peter's just put me in the hot spot to answer the puzzle. Given the paradox of policy performance, why didn't our Prime Minister go higher at COP26? Why did they stick to a target that they took to Paris in 2015, minus 26 to 28% by 2030, even though emissions are set to fall by around 35% anyway? So why not go higher And there's more to the story too. And I'm trying to move these sticky buttons, which are very annoying and not responding. There was intense pressure on the Morrison government by our closest allies, the US and the United Kingdom. In addition to that, we know there's growing public concern over climate change and overwhelming public support for rapid renewable energy development. We know that there's now support from the major industry association groups, the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Business and Commerce and Industry. So there's lots of industry support. Not only that, we've got the Murdoch press has even changed its tune, no longer denying the climate science, which is a huge development in Australian politics. And on top of that, major mining companies are already starting to divest, and we're seeing a lot of Australia's mining, a lot of Australia's billionaires are starting to invest in renewables, most significantly Andrew Forrest from Fortescue Metals. And as Peter said, the states have already done a lot of the heavy lifting, so they've prepared the way. So the puzzle is, why did not the Morrison government make a move here? Now, in political science research in this area would offer a combined political economy and political representation analysis, which is neatly summed up in a book by Matto Mildenberger called The Logic of Double Representation. And in that book, which included Australia in its study, where both major parties and a political system have close ties with the fossil fuel industry, either through their support for investment in that area and campaign finance donations, or workers dependent in the area, what you have is double political representation, and that will impede climate policy. And that's exactly what's happened in this country. But it's made worse by the fact that the coalition government is a coalition. It's not just the Liberal Party, and the Nationals are particularly concerned about political representation of seats in Queensland that are coal dependent, and ditto for New South Wales. And that's why we can have a situation where our Australian Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm waiting for this picture to load, and we all have to be patient here, says something really bizarre like the Nationals didn't sign COP26 and Australia is happy with the targets. So the answer to the puzzle, the superficial answer, is that the coalition couldn't agree on this. However, there is a deeper political economy explanation whereby the two major parties, despite their huge differences on climate policy over the years and the huge climate policy wars, have remained pretty much on the same page in supporting the continuation of fossil fuels in this country. So now let's turn to the forthcoming election. And what I want to do here is briefly look at the policies of the major parties when this slide finally loads. There we go. So there's going to be no change from the coalition in terms of what we already know, in terms of its 2030 target that it didn't raise from 2015, despite pressure to do so at COP26. It's continuing with its two signature policies, the Emissions Reduction Fund, which has been rebadged and called the Climate Solutions Fund, but it is anything but, because it's got a cap on it. There's about $2.55 billion capped on expenditure there. It's essentially a reverse auction where farmers, businesses, and even Indigenous groups come up with emission reduction projects. They make a bid, and the government will award contracts to those businesses that have got the most least cost approach. And if they acquit themselves, then they will earn Australian carbon credits, which they can sell in the market or sell back to the government. Now, this is a pay the polluter scheme rather than a polluter pays scheme. And so the more abatement is going to cost the taxpayer more and more money. This is backed up with a safeguard mechanism, which is essentially an agreement with our biggest polluters, those that are polluting over, I think, 100,000 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, to not go above a certain baseline, which is generously determined in consultation with the industry based on its future growth. Should they go over, then they'll have to purchase Australian carbon units as well, or and cover that gap. So that's very weak, and it hasn't done any work at all. There was a renewable energy policy up to 2020 that's already expired, and there's no 2030 target. And we all know the government has active support for fossil fuels. There were a few extra things thrown in. They're beginning to move a little bit on electric vehicles, despite the Prime Minister once saying they would end the weekend, but it's small biscuits, as it were. Labor's policy, which was announced shortly after COP26 last year, is aiming for minus 43% compared to 29 election when it was minus 45%. They're sticking with the existing arrangements so as not to rock the boat, to try and get it through. They're going to stick with the emissions, they're not going to use the emissions reduction fund. They're going to strengthen the safeguard mechanism by making the baseline more stringent. They've got a bigger policy on electric vehicles. They want to reinstate the Climate Change Authority, which kind of still exists, but has been defanged and largely sidelined. They're aiming for 82% renewable energy in the national electricity market, which of course doesn't include WA, by the end of this decade. They're continuing rather quiet support for fossil fuels, although they've been less quiet lately because the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, has said that their renewable energy policy won't cost jobs in the fossil fuel industry, which is rather implausible. The Greens, of course, have the strongest policies, aiming for minus 75% cut in emissions by the end of the decade and net zero by 2030 or as soon as possible. They support framework climate legislation of the kind that the independent for Warringah introduced into the federal parliament as a bill, a private member's bill, that was not passed. They're supporting some kind of price on fossil fuels to reflect their true costs. They've got very strong policies to support electric vehicles. And they've also got a transport policy that includes tailpipe standards for Australia's vehicles. Now, Labor had that also in its 2019 campaign, but it's taken it out. But it will support electric vehicles by reducing tariffs and reducing the fringe benefit tax on EVs, all but the luxury ones. The Greens, of course, are going for 100% renewable energy. I couldn't find an actual target in their recent policies, but they're still releasing them in dribs and drabs. But they're going really hard on fossil fuels. They want to end subsidies for fossil fuels. They want to phase out thermal coal generation in Australia by the end of the decade. They want to phase out thermal coal exports by 2040. They've put metallurgical coal to one side. And in a direct response to Mildenberger's thesis about the revolving door between the major parties in the fossil fuel industry, they want to ban donations from the mining industry, and they want to have a ban on ministers for resources going into work for the mining industry for a period of 5 years after the minister leaves office, because there's been a history of that, a revolving door. So they're trying to tackle that problem too. Alongside the major parties and the Greens, we have the rise of, there's a number of independents, but a new phenomenon called Voices, where you have kitchen table meetings by locals in constituencies around the country who are coming together around political integrity, democracy, and particularly climate action. Not all of them have managed to choose candidates, but they're building on the success of earlier independent candidates like Haynes from Indi and others, Rebecca Sharkey from Mayo in South Australia. Now, they're running quite a few candidates. It's a complicated story, but they're being well funded by Simon Holmescourt's funding platform called Climate 200, who is matching dollar for dollar what's raised by local community organisations. So they're going to be something to watch in the next election. We can look at One Nation, whose policy is, dare I say, amusing. No targets, and we must withdraw from the Paris Agreement. They have no policies in the area, no subsidies to renewable energy, active support for fossil fuels, and they're wanting us to consider going down a nuclear path as well. There are, of course, other independents and this new outfit called the United Australia Party, which is doing an advertising blitz and has done for some time, vastly outspending the major parties. Clive Palmer is the main business person behind that. And it's going to be interesting to see how well that travels. So where will all this lead in terms of the election that's coming up in May? Well, here, there are many more possible scenarios, but these are the most likely. For some reason, possibly due to preference in coming from One Nation and UAP, if they're not successful, insofar as they're running lower house seats, going back to the coalition, who would still govern, which would govern without a controllable Senate. We don't expect any party winning government to control the numbers in the Senate. So a coalition could get back with a majority or a minority government, and depending on who gives the coalition support, whether it's independents who are pro-climate or whether it's other independents, remains to be seen. Labor plus a uncontrollable Senate, again, could be majority or minority. But if it is minority government, it could be with an extra Green seat, possibly lower house seat picked up, and possibly one or even two climate voices. And Zoe Daniel at the moment is running against Tim Wilson and Goldstein. And at the moment, the polls suggest she's got a reasonable chance of ousting him. There are quite a few others that are very unpredictable, but they're not polling as strongly. So there could be as many as 4 pro-climate Greens and independents in the lower house. And so they could be the kingmakers in the new parliament. If Labor wins with the support, either in majority with a controllable Senate that's climate friendly, or in minority with the sort of formation I just suggested, and also a climate friendly Senate, then Australia can really start to shoot for the stars. So at this point, I think I hand back to you, Peter. Actually, I'll just say 2 things because these relate to our final comments. The IPCC's Working Group 2 report on climate impacts has just come out, and it's telling us that we're going to see more of what we've just seen in recent years, which is the Australian Black Summer, 2019-2020, and of course, what we're seeing in Brisbane at the moment. I wish these slides would move. The wet summer, or the rain bomb, as everyone's describing it, that's hit Brisbane and northern New South Wales at the moment. So this is the sort of weather we're coming to. And one thing I haven't mentioned so far is adaptation. After the Royal Commission on the bushfires, the Morrison government promised to produce a new adaptation policy, but it's not out yet. But at the moment, the Minister for Defence, Dutton, has started a crowdfunding project to deal with the flood, which is a very odd way for a government minister to respond. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Robyn. In fact, there is another slide to come, which I think we're both going to talk to. And that is actually what happens once the election has been resolved. And I think I'd like to invite you to come back for a moment and just talk about your thoughts about COP27, what may happen in Egypt.
Right, yes, I forgot I was going first here. Yes, in the lead up to COP27, everything will depend on the outcome of the election. But Australia is so well situated now to make some big leaps forward and overcome the fact that it's been routinely listed at the bottom of the International Climate Performance Index. On the agenda for the very first time, and Australia is incredibly well situated to seize this opportunity, because not only because of its abundant solar energy and wind resources, but because of its high reserves of critical minerals such as lithium and cobalt and copper, and its wealth of rare earth elements, all of which are used in the manufacture of electric vehicles, in solar PV, wind turbines, smart grids, and so forth. So these resources provide Australia with the opportunity to develop a green manufacturing industry. But not only that, they provide Australia with the opportunity to help our neighbours through just transition partnerships of the kind. There were some examples of that emerged in COP26. So this is something Australia could do in its region, particularly with big emitters like India or Indonesia. A lot of the energy transition, though, is low-hanging fruit, and Australia will have to start looking elsewhere to reduce emissions. But Peter will address that. But finally, the Ukraine war will also prompt all countries, and hopefully Australia too, to understand that the best way of getting energy security is go down a renewable energy path, because we're going to see oil prices and petrol prices really start to hike. And finally, I've mentioned the IPCC report. So I think that's everything, Peter. So over to you to look at the domestic implications.
Thanks very much, Robyn. So this is really crystal ball gazing, and the crystal ball is, of course, very clouded. Irrespective of each of whichever of those three scenarios that Robyn's mapped out as a possible parliamentary outcome and political outcome at the end of this election, my expectation is that there are certain changes which will occur almost irrespective of whether we have a coalition or a Labor government or minority Labor government coming to power in 2022. And that's partly because of the dynamism that I described earlier in this talk. Firstly, in terms of targets, I am quite confident that Australia will change its 2030 target and possibly change it quite dramatically, depending on whether it's the coalition or Labor. But both a coalition or a Labor government will change the target and make it more progressive. More importantly, I think, is what would happen in terms of fiscal policy and regulatory policy. Firstly, the carbon price debate is dead, and I cannot see any version of a carbon price or a carbon tax being instituted by any government in Australia. The political pain associated with that has just simply been too high. However, there will be greater pressure to deal with other elements of de facto carbon pricing, and particularly if Labor gets in, I think that we'll see significant attention being paid to the subsidies and the tax breaks, which have been continuing to support carbon production in Australia, including export carbon production. I don't expect there will be significant intervention by a national government in renewables directly. That's an area which, as I suggested, has already been largely taken over and indeed quite appropriately run by the states, but also I think market forces now are pushing very hard in that particular space, except for one particular area in which I think there can and should be a significant federal intervention, and that's in the transport sector and increased investment and assistance to ensure that we have a rollout of electric vehicles within the next decade, which with funding and subsidies and with coordination at the national level is a significant additional area of emissions reduction, even though I think the pace for transformation there is beginning to pick up quite significantly. In terms of green industry policy and green hydrogen, green steel, I'm a skeptic when it comes to that. I have a slight difference of view with Ross Garno about the levels of optimism that one should hold in that particular space, particularly given the nature and structure of investment in that industry and the sort of demand and supply issues which will arise as that industry matures. So I don't have enormous faith in that, but I do think that Labor in particular, but also the coalition, will now begin to have to pay some significant attention to regulatory matters, which the disorderly or the chaotic exit of coal is beginning to sort of bring very much to the fore. In other words, there has to be an exit plan. There has to be what people are calling a just transition plan, or some forms of structural compensation to deal with the implications, regional and otherwise, of the collapse of coal-fired power generation. Lastly, the area which is really the elephant or the mine in the room is export fossil fuels. And I think that this is going to be an area of increasing and very public contention, because it is the area in which Australia has made the most significant contribution to the climate problematic. Overall, if you take our domestic and our embodied exported emissions into account, we're the world's 6th largest producer of carbon-related emissions. And this is going to become an area both of international and also domestic pressure. Of course, all of this depends on what the parliamentary mix is going to be, but those are the things that I see in that opaque crystal ball. And I'm trying to move the slides on. So a couple of, just some articles that we've referred to in the talk that we've just given and the comments that we've just made. If anyone wants to refer to those later, well and good. And I think we're really open for discussion. So if we can move to the last slide, that'd be great. An optimistic slide of a very, very large solar farm built in Victoria. Peter, back to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks for a fantastic kind of tour of a ridiculously complicated environment. And I'm going to take the host's privilege of asking the first question as usual, which might complicate it even a bit more, because I want to ask about the international posture that both parties have taken to the various COPs over the years, and how the kind of difference in the way they're projecting themselves to their supporters and to the international community, how you think that might look post-election? What will their, independent of what they do at home, how different will they look at the next COP to each other, do you think?
Robyn.
Well, I have had the pleasure of sitting in the plenary session of the Conference of the Parties in Durban in 2011, when Greg Combay walked into the plenary and got a standing ovation. That has never happened at a COP before. This was a time when the COPs
Not true.
were at an
Kevin Rudd got
yeah, Kevin Rudd did too in 2007 in Bali, and it's always been a Labor government. What was unique about then? That was when the roadmap for developing the Paris Agreement was forged as well, and so Australia has not always been seen as a laggard, but I think now it's just so easy for Australia not to be a laggard. You know, we're trying to explain to mention this, and it's been the coalition internal politics and also Labor's reading of why they lost the last election that's made them play safe and try and avoid damage. So I think that Australia's well placed to play a much more proactive role, and it could happen quite quickly.
Great. On that optimistic note, I'll step back out of the way and hand over to more general Q&A.
Thanks, Peter. I'll jump in there so that we can curate some Q&As. And firstly, just an apology for the issues with the slides. We did test this earlier and it was working okay for me to share the slides and for Peter and Robyn to control them. But as soon as we got into the live presentation, our computers stopped talking to each other. So a little bit unhelpful, but I do apologize for that. We've had a few questions, and what I'll do is I will invite people to unmute themselves once as we bring up these sort of questions. So I'm going to start here with the first question we had, which was quite earlier on, which was Roger. And Roger, I'm just trying to find you now. If you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Hi. I guess I was just curious as to what you think will happen as regard the latest climate change report regarding the severity of climate change and how rapidly it's occurring, coupled with the floods that we're seeing in Brisbane and around the north and eastern section of New South Wales. Will that make people change their policies, or will it cause the public to think twice about voting for someone who's going to act on climate?
It's a great question, Roger, if I may, Robyn. So we had the same question, in a sense, arise after the Black Summer fires, where we had that astonishing scenario of devastation throughout much of Australia. And of course, all of that was overrun by an even greater crisis, or a much more substantial and systemic crisis associated with COVID and the COVID pandemic. So it's very hard to make any sort of predictions as to how a climate-related crisis is going to play out. What was very clear, though, with the fires was that the sort of denialism that went with these sorts of events had been swept to one side. It was no longer possible for people to simply say, oh, it's a natural event, even though of extraordinary proportions. And I think the debate about loss and damage in Australia now is a very substantial one. One area in which policy is definitely going to have to change, and it's changed a little bit over the last decade, is in the provision of emergency funding to deal with disaster relief, and the ways in which insurance and other forms of relief, private and public, are going to have to integrate and deal with these sorts of issues. Whether it's going to lead to a direct impact on climate and energy policy, I wouldn't be confident that that's the case. One always hopes that it's going to be the case, but it very rarely is. That's my take on that. Robyn?
Look, I think you've said most of it. I mean, there is quite a bit of research on what happens after climate-related disasters, and they can be a major learning experience, but often they're not. And the large studies that have been done show they tend not to be in countries that are dependent on fossil fuel. So there's one answer. So far, a lot of people don't like talking about climate change during the emergency. And yet that's the window when you can actually say, well, this happened. This water bomb over Brisbane and northern New South Wales was so big. We've never seen this before. There's been bigger floods, but we haven't had so much rain occur so quickly. And that's exactly what the science has been telling us going to happen. So these 1 in 100 year events are going to happen a lot more frequently. So Peter's point about where's the money going to come from? and to what if this kind of damage becomes uninsurable is a really big political question that people need to be asking.
Angela.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Francisco, who unfortunately it seems has left, but it's a really good question. So, are there signs that the ALP will increase their climate targets and raise ambition if elected to government?
Well, they would be very wary to promise one thing in the election and do something else afterwards, because that really harmed Julia Gillard in saying off the cuff there will be no carbon tax under my government, and then subsequently introducing it because it was part of the power sharing arrangement with the Greens in the minority Labor government, and she was beaten up over that hugely. So in a sense, it doesn't matter if they overachieve. No one will blame them for that. But if they raise the target and say it's something they didn't do, I know that the coalition will pounce on them. But possibly that kind of attack won't work anymore because things are changing so quickly. But certainly Labor is still chastened by that event, that mistake of Gillard's. So I think they might, this is just me guessing, they might want to sit back and just say, look, we've overachieved, look how great we are, without changing any promises. I mean, because the amount of money that they're kicking in, and I didn't have time to mention this, but we're talking about billions going into smartening our grid so that they can cope with a lot more renewables. There's a lot of money that Labor are going to throw at renewable energy, far, far more than the coalition. And that will do most of the heavy lifting.
Can I give a slightly different answer, not in disagreement, but actually referring to some of the work that Robyn and I did with subnational governments and with climate legislation? I would think that the best way for Labor, or for a progressive climate-focused government, and it may be a coalition that's driven by forces somewhat different from the ones we see at the moment, to progress, is actually put in place a legislated target and target revision mechanism, the sort that the Brits did. So there's the UK climate change legislation, which has got a rolling independent review process, which ramps up, ratchets up the target on a regular and predictable way. This was already built in many senses into the proposals that Ross Garnaut put forward in, over a decade ago, when we were talking about an emissions trading scheme. And we've seen the same thing already implemented in subnational states, in particular in Victoria. So my expectation would be, one, Labor will articulate a stronger target than the coalition and much closer to what we need, but still pretty weak. But it may put in place, and it depends on how the Senate goes, it may put in place a mechanism, an independent mechanism, which actually then begins to bureaucratically drive this process and to some extent depoliticise it, which is really, I mean, it's fanciful to believe that it will be completely depoliticised, but to give it some sort of automatic and mechanical purchase, which then makes it much easier for governments and others to debate the outcome and direction.
Great, thank you. The next question's got a couple of upvotes, so I'll just remind people, please keep popping your questions in the Q&A and upvote the questions that are there so that we can prioritise the ones that everyone is interested in. This one is a question from Alan Pierce, so go ahead, Alan.
Okay, thanks very much, and hi guys. Yeah, look, I know I'm seen as a bit of an obsessive about this, but how do you see the role of energy efficiency playing out in Australian climate policy in a context where the European Union have declared it the energy efficiency first approach, and the International Energy Agency for a long time has, in its scenarios, suggested energy efficiency will deliver at least as much emission reduction as renewables, and energy efficiency, according to the IEA, actually has very substantial multiple economic, social and environmental benefits. But if you look at the debate we've had the last few weeks about various climate and energy issues, I have seen no mention at all. So should I give up, or have you got some suggestions about how this might play out?
So for those who don't know, Alan really is legendary in promoting and prosecuting this particular argument. And I think you're absolutely right in two senses. One, it is in fact a very important policy area for achieving greater emissions reductions. But also, I think that it has just not been on the policy agenda. And I think that what's happened is that partly because of the neoliberal turn, which basically overtook climate policy and saw the privatisation of the power sector and so on, goes deeply into the hearts of those who would look at this policy. And I think the expectation people are having within government, others may want to comment on this, is that actually it'll be energy prices that drive efficiency, which of course is an insufficient way of dealing with the transition problem. And it's a slow and often very painful way of dealing with it. But to be honest, I just see no life in that argument, either at the subnational level or at the national level, despite its many very considerable merits.
I'll just jump in to say that efficiency is a big element of the Greens policy. So it is there in one of the parties. And if it turns out that the Greens are part of a minority government, it could percolate back into whatever the government's, Labor government, minority Labor government's policy, because it's a no-brainer. But yes, it's always been the poor relation of just promoting renewable energy, and yet it's the first best solution. So I just agree with your position.
But don't give up, Alan, please.
Don't give up, Alan, no.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for that. The next question is from John Englert, who's got a question for Peter, and then I'll go to Wendy's question.
There's actually one from Wendy Cox, which is sitting up there above John's.
Yeah, I just said that we'd go to Wendy's after that. Sorry, it's
right. Okay.
Yep. Perfect. John, go ahead.
In regard to the prospect for climate damages tax on fossil fuel. So this would be a highly targeted tax and could start at a relatively low level to raise money for addressing climate adaptation to extreme weather events, or to subsidise a contribution to loss and damages on a global level. What are the prospects?
So just in case people missed the first part of that, what are the prospects for a climate damages tax or levy on fossil fuel exports? This has been something the Greens have been proposing, and also parts of the environment movement, for some time. And I think it has enormous merit. However, politically, I think it's probably pretty close to a dead dog, at least at this point in time. It does leave us with a very significant problem, which is that we are contributing directly to significant loss and damage. And there is a very powerful and painful debate in the international negotiating fora about how loss and damage will be paid for. And there will, I think, eventually be a requirement that developed countries, and in particular fossil fuel countries, fossil fuel exporting countries, which have benefited so substantially from those exports, will have to contribute to that. But in the short term, I just don't see it as politically substantial. Having said that, it may just be the case that some people get a little bit of courage and see that as a better way of dealing with the constant expansion of Australian fossil fuel exports. But frankly, I think that regulatory approaches are probably going to be more likely, and the removal of subsidies are more likely as the first ports of policy call ahead of that.
There is one more factor to consider here, which is the growth of climate litigation and the way that the fiduciary duty of corporate directors is such that they owe it to shareholders to lay bare the full nature of risks that the company may be exposed to, not just to their business operation, but to their markets and their supply lines and so forth. So I think that fiduciary duty, combined with possible negligence, tort claims, and the growth of attribution science, where with very large oil majors or very large corporations that have been around for a while, you can actually pinpoint the percentage of contribution to the problem, then there's a possibility that, well, it's already starting to sober the negotiations of corporate boards, and that, with the rise of shareholder activism, are also going to be putting corporations in a kind of pincer movement. So even without those kinds of regulatory measures, there's a whole lot of other forces out there that are forcing companies to change.
Let me give a slightly different version of an answer then as well. So there is an area which gives me great concern, and I don't think anyone has done sufficient work on it just yet, which has to do with the remediation, the environmental and social remediation, closure of coal in particular coal mines and coal-related facilities, which will run into the billions of dollars. And that in itself, I mean, that will be a version of loss and damage to the Australian economy if we have to pay for it as a public, as opposed to the companies concerned. So there's another sort of loss and damage issue in there, which I think we need to be attentive to. It may not be the levy or tax on exports, but it may be another way of dealing with the damage that, in particular, the export fossil fuel sector is generating for Australia as well as the rest of the world. If we are able to free up or at least not spend billions of dollars in remediation, that will be money that could be used elsewhere, including in terms of dealing with loss and damage globally.
Thanks, Peter. The next question, as I said earlier, is from Wendy Cox. So go ahead, please, Wendy.
Yes, my question is in relation to the Ukraine crisis. Is this going to be used by the government to justify promoting more gas in order to fill the perceived, well, there is an EU gap, but the question is, I'm not really expecting that it's Australia is going to fill that gap, or is it? And can this argument be countered?
Well, Australia's already got its gas markets sewn up with contracts. So it's not going to be easy for them to break those contracts to increase the supply to needy Europeans. It's one of the reasons our gas prices have gone up so much, because we're paying the international price of gas, and our gas producers get good prices on the international market. So whereas the Obama administration for a period had export controls on gas, so gas stayed quite low in price, and that's what killed coal in the US under his watch. So there's that. Australia won't really benefit hugely. But I think the broader lesson is that the Europeans have realised that they're highly exposed to Gazprom. The Germans were hooked up and the gas was about to flow in Nord Stream 2 from Russia to Germany, and they've now suspended the flowing of that gas because of the crisis. Energy prices are going up, and that's what's freaking out Europe. That's what will freak out Europeans. But overall, Australians will suffer this at the petrol pump because of rising oil prices, because Russia is a large oil exporter, not just gas exporter. So that just adds to the, oil is a really hard thing to replace. In lots of other industries, we've got the EV revolution that will sweep through the transport sector, at least on ground, if not shipping. But certainly oil is used in a lot of other industries as well, like plastics and so forth. But that's another story. But I think generally speaking, Twiggy Forrester, as he's affectionately called, is right to say that green energy is energy security.
Look, I agree with Robyn. I think that the big problem, of course, is, and we don't know how this is going to play out, of course, but the duration of the crisis is one of the issues. The severity of the crisis is another one. Clearly, Europe has now generated an energy crisis for itself. It's not one that wasn't predicted in many ways, and there have been lots of discussions within the EU about energy and particularly gas dependency on Russia. And there was an earlier incident when they turned off the tap in 2006 as a way of punishing the Ukraine, which gave Germany in particular an insight as to what over-dependency means. I think there'll be processes of compensation put in place, but I'm not sure that the Australian market or Australian production is responsive enough to be able to take advantage of that. And I hope that's the answer.
Just one final point on that. If we think of the geopolitical fallout of the two OPEC crises in the 1970s, we saw Japan respond very differently to the US. The US continued to make gas guzzling cars, and the Japanese moved towards highly efficient cars. And they didn't kill the US car industry, but they certainly yielded a significant blow to that industry. So necessity is the mother of invention. When prices of inputs go up, then industry will look for other sources. So it could catalyze a whole lot of innovations to get to wean different industries off oil beyond transport as well.
Angela.
Thanks very much. Conscious that we're running low on time, so we can either go with one more question or we can go with maybe 3 or 4 speed answers, depending on how we go. So I'm going to go first to Alan Barley's question about green hydrogen, and then if we get time, we'll go to Jordan and then to Roger. So Alan, go ahead. We'll see how many we can get in the last couple of minutes.
Okay, have to question Peter's comment about hydrogen. why wouldn't it actually be the key input to raise the added value of our unprocessed mineral ores? The chemistry and the energy aspects of that make it pretty logical. It's the best way of compensating for the loss of coal and LNG exports that will inevitably occur. Roscoe, Saul Griffiths and many others are strongly, Twiggy Forrest obviously, chasing hydrogen with a lot of enthusiasm, so why aren't you?
I will when I'm convinced. So look, I think that the displacement of fossil fuels in the processing of metal ore exports is very important, without a doubt, and getting rid of metallurgical coal is critically important. But there's a question that I have to throw back to you, which is, when we were in the days when fossil fuels were dirt cheap and Australian fossil fuels were exceptionally cheap, why was it that we never actually got to the point of actually having further manufactured or highly processed manufactures out of our ores at that point in time? So I think that the answer is a much more complicated one, to do with the various elements and dynamics of ore processing in the metals market and so on. And it doesn't simply come down to the cost of that energy input. Green hydrogen is going to be very important, but why wouldn't a country as large as China be able to produce its own green hydrogen, or a dozen other places, at costs which are comparable to Australia's? So I'm not quite convinced that the economics stack up. I'm not sure that that's a right answer, but I haven't quite been sold on, you know, the green Kool-Aid as far as this particular approach is concerned, just yet. Happy to be convinced.
China doesn't have the renewable resources nor the mineral ore resources that we have here, so that seems to me to be the answer to that question.
China has massive renewable resources, and it can build more, and to scale. I mean, the scale with which it's built its renewable sector, even though, you know, as a percentage of its energy generation is not as good as we would like, but it has capacity that is, as is in Australia, untapped. So I'm not quite sure that we quite have got a clean argument or a clean answer there.
Hello.
Alrighty, Jordan, very, very quick. You're going to be our last question for the night because we are up on time. All right, are you there, Jordan?
I think we have a technical
I
problem.
cannot.
That's okay, I'll go ahead and ask for you. That's not a problem. So in a recent EU paper, just transition is mentioned 79 times, and in an Australian paper, 135 times. However, these do not explain how we judge what a just transition is. How should we judge a just transition?
In 10
I
words.
suspect whatever we do, we're not going to be able to do it justice in the amount of time left. I think it's a very complicated.
I'll finish with a one sentence. We can judge it by the degree to which it genuinely consults the community, and that they feel they have input and own it. And it has to be part of a broader regional development strategy. And I think they're the key ingredients.
And I think that's a beautiful way to end. I think, you know, thinking about, we'll be talking about various forms of action that we can take. It's very clear that there's going to be a range of communities affected as we go through that. And I think a recipe for how to do that well is an excellent way for us to finish a seminar thinking about how the politics of this might work. There are so many questions I would have liked to ask. I suspect there are a lot more others out there as well. I'm lucky I get the chance to ask Robyn and Peter at other places, but it's such an evolving topic. I mean, it would have been very hard to predict how the whole climate catastrophe has played out in Australian politics since over the last 20 years, and yet here we are, and I think there's a perhaps slightly more optimistic story. So thanks very much for taking us through that extraordinary kind of sweep over the Australian political landscape. It's clearly been such a defining issue. The fact that it may now be settling into a more conventional place in the Australian politics is an interesting change. A reminder to everyone that we will probably still have at least a couple more events around the program. We have one more seminar on, if I recall, the role of digitalisation in information and how useful that can be. And we have, following up from Alan's comment earlier, a launch of a report on the role of energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, which are a major sector. So again, keep watching the website and your email for pointers to those. Thanks very much again to Peter and to Robyn. A fantastic summary of a super complicated problem.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.